ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشى الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم قالوا طائركم معكم إن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أأتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يريد الرحمن بالضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخلوا الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كما أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالعرجون القديم لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون وآية لهم أن حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم بمثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أن نطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا ما بعثنا من مركزنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب الرحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم أن لا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا الصراط المستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نؤمر ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبه ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند مهزرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد الفاتحة.
पर मोहम्मद वाले मोहम्मद सलवात सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि मोहम्मद वाले मोहम्मद।
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم إني أسألك برحمتك التي وسعت كل شيء وبقوتك التي قهرت بها كل شيء وخزعنا كل شيء وذلنا كل شيء وبجبروتك التي غلبت بها كل شيء وبعزتك التي لا يقوم لها شيء وبعظمتك التي ملأت كل شيء وبسلطانك الذي على كل شيء وبوجهك الباقي بعد فناء كل شيء وبأسمائك التي ملت أركان كل شيء وبعلمك الذي أحاط بكل شيء وبنور وجهك الذي أضاء له كل شيء يا نور يا قدوس يا أول الأولين ويا آخر الآخرين اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تهتك العصام اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل النقام اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تغير النعم اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تحبس الدعاء اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل البلاء اللهم اغفر لي كل ذنب أذنبته وكل خطية أخطأتها اللهم إني أتقرب إليك بذكرك واستشفي بك إلى نفسك وأسألك بجودك أن تدنيني من قربك وأن توزعني شكرك وأن تلهمني ذكرك اللهم إني أسألك سؤال خازع متذلل خاشع أن تسامحني وترحمني وتجعلني بقسمك راضيا قانعا وفي جميع الأحوال متواضعا اللهم وأسألك سؤال من اشتدت فاقته وأنزل بك عند الشدائد حاجته وعزم فيما عندك رغبته اللهم عزم سلطانك وعلى مكانك وخافي مكرك وزهر أمرك وغلب قهرك وجرت قدرتك ولا يمكن الفرار من حكومتك اللهم لا أجد لذنوب غافرا ولا لكبائه ساترا ولا لشبنم للكبيب الحسن يبدلا غيرك لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك وبحمدك ظلمت نفسي وتجرأت بجهلي وسكنت إلى قديم ذكرك ليمنك علي اللهم مولاي كم من كبيه سترت وكم من فاده من البلاء يقلت وكم من إيثاء وقيت وكم من مكروه دفعت وكم من ثناء جميل لست أهلا له نشرت اللهم أعز ولائي وفت بي سوء حالي وقصرت بي أعمالي وقعدت بي أغلالي وحبسني النفي بعد أملي وخدعت الدنيا بغرورها ونفسي بجناية مطالي يا سيدي فأسألك بعزتك أن لا يحجبنك دعائي سوء عملي وفعالي ولا تفزعني بخفي ما اطلعت عليه من سري ولا تعاجلني من عقوبتي على ما عملت في خلواتي من سوء فعلي وإساءتي ودوام تفريطي وجهالتي وكثرة شهواتي وغفلتي وكن اللهم بعزتك لي في كل الأحوال رؤوفا وعلي في جميع الأمور عطوفا إلهي وربي من لي غيرك أسأل كشف الزر والنزر في أمري إلهي مولاي أجريت علي حكما اتبعت في هوى نفسي ولم أحترس فيه من تزيين عدوي فغرني بما أهوى وأسأد على ذلك القضاء فتجاوزت بما جرى علي من ذلك بعد حدودك وخالفت بعد أوامرك فلك الحمد علي في جميع ذلك ولا حجة لي فيما جرى علي في قضاءك والزمني حكمك وبلاؤك وقد أتيتك يا إلهي بعد تقصيري وإسرافي على نفسي معتذرا نادما منكسرا مستقيلا مستغفرا منيبا مقرا مدعنا معترفا لا أجد مفر ما كان مني ولا مفزا أتوجه إليه في أمري غير قبولك عذري وإدخالك إياي في سعة من رحمتك اللهم فاقبل عذري وارحم شدة زري وفكني من شد وثاقي يا رب ارحم زاف بدني ورقة جلدي ودكة عزمي يا من بدا خلقي وذكري وتربيتي وبري وتغذيتي هبني لابتداء كرمك وسالف برك بي يا إلهي وسيدي وربي أتراك معذب بنارك بعد توحيدك وبعد من تواي عليه قلب من معرفتك وليج به لسان من ذكرك واعتقده زميلي من حبك وبعد صدق اعترافي ودعائي خاضعا لربوبيتك هيهات أن تكره من أن تزي من ربيت أو تبعد من أدنيت أو تشرد من آويت أو تسلم إلى البلاء من كفيته ورحمت وليت شعري يا سيدي وإلهي مولاي أتسلط النار على وجوه أخرت لازمتك ساجدا وعلى ألسن نطقت بتوحيدك الصادقة وشكرك مادحا وعلى قلوب اعترفت بإلهيتك محققة، وعلى زمائر حوات من العلم بك حتى صارت خاشعة، وعلى جواري سعت إلى أوطان تعبدك طائعة، وأشهد باستغفارك مطئنا ما هكذا ظنوا بك، ولا أخبرنا بفضلك عنك يا كريم. يا ربي وأنت تعلم ضعفي عن قليل بلاء الدنيا وعقوباتها وما يجري فيها من المكاره على أهلها، على أن ذلك بلاء ومكروه قليل مكثو يسير بقاء قصير مدته، فكيف احتمال بلاء الآخرة وجليل وقوع المكاره فيها، وهو بلاء تطول مدته ويدوم مقامه ولا يخفف عن أهله، لأنه لا يكون إلا عن غضبك وانتقامك وسخطك، وهذا ما لا تقوم له السماوات والأرض. يا سيدي فكيف لي وأنا عبدك الضعيف الذليل الحقير المسكين المستكين. يا إلهي وربي وسيدي مولاي، لي الأمور إليك أشكو، ولما منها أزج، وأبكي لأليم عذابي وشدتي، أم لطول البلاء مدتي، فلئن سيرتني للعقوبات مع أعدائك، وجمعت بيني وبين أهل بلائك، وفرقت بيني وبين أحبائك وأوليائك، فابني يا إلهي وسيدي مولاي وربي صبرت على عذابك، فكيف أصبر على فراقك؟ وابني صبرت على حر نارك، فكيف أصبر عن النظر إلى كرامتك؟ أم كيف أسكن في النار ورجاء عفوك؟ وبعزتك يا سيدي مولاي أقسم سعادك إن تركتني ناطقا، لا أزيجن إليك بين أهل زجيج الآملين، ولا أصرخن إليك صراخ المستصرخين، ولا أبكين عليك بكاء الفاقدين، ولو نادينك إن كنت يا ولي المؤمنين، يا غاية أمل العارفين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا حبيب قلوب الصادقين، ويا إله العالمين، أفتراك سبحانك يا إلهي بحمدك تسمع فيها صوت عبد مسلم سجن فيها مخالفته، وذاك تعمى عذابها بمعصيتك، وحبس بين أطباقها بجرمه وجريرته، ويزج إليك زجيجا مؤملا لرحمتك، ويناديك بلسان أهل توحيدك، ويتوسل إليك بربوبيتك. يا مولاي فكيف يبقى في العذاب ويرجو ما سلف من حلمك؟ أم كيف تؤلم النار وهو يأمل فضلك ورحمتك؟ أم كيف يهركه لهيبها وأنت تسمع صوتا وترى مكانا؟ أم كيف يشتمل عليه زفيرها وأنت تعلم زعفا؟ أم كيف يتقلقل بين أتباكها وأنت تعلم صدقا؟ أم كيف تزجر زبانيتها وهو يناديك يا ربا؟ أم كيف يرجو فضلك في إتق منها وتتركه فيها هيهات؟ ما ذلك ظن بك ولا المعروف من فضلك، ولا مشبه لما عملت بالموحد من برك وإحسانك باليقين. أقطوا لولا ما حكمت به من تأذيب جاحدك وقضيت به من إخلاد معاندك، لجعلت النار كلها بردا وسلاما، وما كانت لهاد فيها مقرا ولا مقاما. لكنك تقدست أسماؤك، أقسمت أن تملأها من الكافرين من الجنة والناس أجمعين، وأن تخلد فيها المعاندين، وأن تجلت الناوك قلت مبتدعا، وتتولت بالإنعام متكرما. أفمن كان مؤمنا كمن كان فاسقا لا يستوون. إلهي وسيدي فأسألك بالقدرة التي قدرتها وبالكزية التي حتمتها وحكمتها وغلبت من علي أجريتها، أن تاب لي في هذه الليلة وفي هذه الساعة كل جرم أجرمت وكل ذنب أذنبت وكل كبيه أسررت وكل جهل عملته، كتمت وأعلنت، أغفيت وأزهرت، وكل سيئة أمرت بإثبات الكرام الكاتبين. الذي نقلت بحفظ ما يكون مني وجعلتهم شهودا علي مع جوارحي وكنت أنت الرقيب علي من ورائهم والشاهد لما خفي عنهم وبرحمتك أغفيت بفضلك سترت وأن توفر حظ من كل خير أنزلت أو إحسان فزلت أو بر نشرت أو رزق بسطها أو ذنب تغفر وخطأ تستر يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا إلهي وسيدي مولاي مالك الرق يا من بيدي ناصيتي يا عليم نزول مسكنتي يا خبير بفقر وفاقتي يا ربي يا ربي يا رب أسألك بحقك وقدسك وعزم صفاتك واسمائك أن تجعل أوقاتي من الليل والنهار بذكرك معمورا بخدمتك موصولا وعمل عندك مقبولا حتى تكون أمالي وأورادي كلها وردا واحدا وعالي في خدمتك سرمدا يا سيدي يا من عليه معولي يا من إليه شكوت أحوالي يا ربي يا ربي يا رب قوي على خدمتك جوارحي واشدد لزيمتي جوانحي وابلي الجد في خشيتك والدوام في الامتثال بخدمتك حتى أسرع إليك في ميادين السابقين وأسرع إليك في البارزين واشتاق إلى قربك في المشتاقين وأدنو منك دنو المخلصين وأخافك مخافة الموقنين واجتمع في جوارك مع المؤمنين اللهم من أرادني بسوء فارده ومن كادني فكده واجعل من أحسن عبيدك نصيبا عندك وأقرب منزلة منك وأخسهم زلفة لديك فإنه لا ينال ذلك إلا بفضلك وجد لي بجودك واعطف علي بمجدك واحفظني برحمتك واجعل لسان بذكرك لهجا وقلبي بحبك متيما ومن علي بحسن إجابتك وقلني أثرتي واغفر زلتي فإنك غزيت على عبادك بعبادتك وأمرتهم بدعائك وزمنت لهم الإجابة فإليك يا رب نسبت وجهي وإليك يا رب مددت يدي فبعزتك استجب لي دعائي وبلغني منايا ولا تقطع من فضلك رجائي واكفني شر الجن والإنس من أعدائي يا سريع الرزاق اغفر لمن لا يملك إلا الدعاء فإنك فعال لما تشاء يا من اسمه دواء وذكره شفاء وطاعته غنى ارحم من رأس ماله الرجاء وسلاحه البكاء يا سابغ النعم يا دافع النقم يا نور المستوحشين في الظلم يا عالما لا يعلم صل على محمد وآل محمد وافعل بما أنت أهله وصلى الله على رسول والأئمة الميامين من آله وسلم تسليما كثيرا.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sheikh Bilal, respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tonight's recitation of Surah Yasin was sponsored for the Thawab of the Marhumin on the screen. Please recite Surah Al-Mubarak Al-Fatiha. Tomorrow, Friday, October 13th, we will have Salatul Jumah beginning at 12:15 p.m. with Dua Nutbah. On Saturday, October 14th, we'll have a special general meeting to go over plans for Hicksville and the variance application. We'll also go over a status update on our Woodside, Jericho, and Uniondale properties. We request all our Jamaat members and their families to attend and participate. The start time, I believe, is 6 p.m. Let us please recite 5 times the ayah of Amma Yujib for all those who are struggling here and around the world. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Amma yujibu al-muttarra idha da'ahu wa yakshifu as-su'. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء 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 اللهم صل على محمد. And lastly, let us please recite Surah Fatiha for all of our marhumin, specifically those who've lost their lives in Palestine. Surah Al-Fatiha. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
So hang on a second. I'm going to borrow this for a second. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. No, I'll do dua here and then, so let me explain. So, a lot of changes tonight, huh? Different hall, a lot of different things going on. We're taking some time tonight to recite Dua Ahl al-Thaghur. Many of us are familiar with what's going on in the world right now, and we've been hearing in the news, and it's an issue that we need to address very carefully, very attentively, and talk about in our community, educate our youth, and have an opinion about. But before we go outside with opinions, one of the things that internally that we have is our relationship with Allah. And the view of oppression and injustice in the world should always turn us first back to Allah. Dua Ahl al-Thaghur is one of the du'as in Saifa Sajadiyah. Saifa Sajadiyah, many times we've mentioned, is a book of prescriptions, that when you find a difficulty in life, one of the places where we look for the solutions of that difficulty and turning back to Allah is Saifa Sajadiyah. So sure enough, even in this situation where we find this conflict, this issue, this problem, and we're not sure what to do with it, the first places we turn to is look to our book of prescriptions and see, is there something to assist us? Dua Ahl al-Thaghur is also known as the dua of the people of the frontiers. And in this dua is a discussion about those people, those Muslimin, who find themselves in a condition of aman and safety. And they're praying for the Muslimin who are going through difficulty and conflict around the world. As such, this dua becomes a good prescription for us in this situation, that where we find ourselves in a place of comfort and ease, yet we're remembering that there are Muslimin who are suffering through difficulty. We'll have the dua on the screen as well too. I'd like you to, as we're going through the dua, to pay attention to the language. See how Allah talks about, in one aspect, giving strength to the Muslimin and us praying for their strength in the face of difficulty. On the other hand, us praying to Allah to remove the strength of the enemies of the Muslimin. And in the final areas, you'll see the conversation of where we're actually saying to Allah that those of us who cannot attend and cannot support, by our consideration of the Muslimin, give us the best of rewards for caring for the Muslimin as well too. So this prescription, when you listen to the dua, seems to fit very well with the condition that we find ourselves in and the need that we have. And being that it's Thursday night, the night of dua, when we collectively sit together and recite this dua, it is something that we pray for its acceptance, as well as we pray that it gives us comfort and aids the Muslimin wherever they are. And its frequent recitation is something that in these days, as we hear about these conflicts and problems, is something that inshallah should be a source of both comfort for us as well as our effort in favor of supporting Islam and Muslimin. After that, inshallah, we'll be having a small workshop discussion around Salatul Ayat, and then inshallah we'll finish with Ziyarati Waratha. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. We're reciting this dua on our behalf, on behalf of all of the mu'mineen, all those who are in need of assistance, and all of our family members. قربة إلى الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآله وحسن ثغور المسلمين بعزتك وأيد هماتها بقوتك وأسبغ أطاياهم من جدتك. اللهم صل على محمد وآله وكثر عدتهم واشحذ أسلحتهم واحرس حوزتهم وامنح حومتهم وألف جمعهم ودبر أمرهم وواتر بين مريهم وتوحد بكفاية مؤنهم وأعضدهم بالنصر وأعنهم بالصبر والتف لهم في المكر. اللهم صل على محمد وآله وعرفهم ما يجهلون وعلمهم ما لا يعلمون وبصرهم ما لا يبصرون. اللهم صل على محمد وآله وأنسهم عند لقائهم العدوى ذكرى دنياهم الجداعة الغرور وامحو عن قلوبهم خطرات المال الفتون واجعل الجنة نسب أعينهم ولوح منها لأبصارهم ما أعددت فيها من مساكن الخلد ومنازل الكرامة والحور الحسان والأنهار المضطردة بأنواع الأشربة والأشجار المتدلية بصنوف الثمر حتى لا يحم أحد منهم بالإدبار ولا يحدث نفسه عن قرنه بفرار. اللهم أفلل بذلك عدوهم واقلم عنهم أظفارهم وفرق بينهم وبين أسلحتهم واخلع وثائق أفئدتهم وباعد بينهم وبين أزودتهم وهيرهم في سبلهم واضللهم عن وجههم واقطع عنهم المدد وانقص منهم العدد واملأ أفئدتهم الرعب واقبض أيديهم عن البسط واخزم ألسنتهم عن النطق وشرد بهم من خلفهم ونكل بهم من وراءهم واقطع بخزيهم أطماع من بعدهم. اللهم أقم أرحام نسائهم ويئس أسلاب رجالهم واقطع نسل دوابهم وأنعامهم لأتأذن لسمائهم في قطر ولا لأرضهم في نبات. اللهم وقوي بذلك محال أهل الإسلام وحسن به ديارهم وثمر به أموالهم وفرغهم عن محاربتهم لعبادتك وعن منابذتهم للخلوة بك حتى لا يعبد في بقاء الأرض غيرك ولا تعرف لأحد منهم جبهة دونك. اللهم أغزو بكل ناحية من المسلمين على من بإزائهم من المشركين وامددهم بملائكة من عندك مردفين حتى يكشفوهم إلى منقطع التراب قتلا في أرضك وأسران أو يقروا بأنك أنت الله الذي لا إله إلا أنت وحدك لا شريك لك. اللهم واعمم بذلك أعداءك في أقطار البلاد من الهند والروم والتركي والخزري والحبشي والنوبة والزنجي والسقالبة والديالمة والسائر أمم الشرق الذي تخفى أسماؤهم وصفاتهم وقد أحصيتهم بمعرفتك وأشرفت عليهم بقدرتك. اللهم اشغل المشركين بالمشركين عن تناول أطراف المسلمين وخذهم بالنقص عن تنقصهم وثبتهم بفرقتي عن الاحتشاد عليهم. اللهم أخلي قلوبهم من الأمنة وأيدانهم من القوة وأذهل قلوبهم عن الاحتيال وأوهن أركانهم عن منازلة الرجال وجبنهم عن مقارعة الأبطال وابعث عليهم جندا من ملائكتك وببعث من بعثك كفعلك يوم بدر تقطع به دابرهم وتحسد به شوقتهم وتفرق به عددهم. اللهم وامزجوا مياههم بالوباء وأطعمتهم بالأدواء وارمي بلادهم بالخسوف وألح عليها بالقذوف وافرعها بالمحول واجعل ميراهم في أحس أرضك وأبعدها عنهم وامنع حسونها منهم وأصبهم بالجوع المقيم والسقم الأليم. اللهم وأيما غاز غزاهم من أهل ملتك أو مجاهد جاهدهم من أتباع سنتك ليكون دينك الأعلى وحزبك الأقوى وحظك الأوفى فلقه اليسر وهيئ له الأمر وتوله بالنجح وتخير له الأصحاب واستقوله الظهر وأسبغ عليه في النفقة ومتعه بالنشاط وأدفي عنه حرارة الشوق وأجره من غم الوحشة وانسه ذكر الأهل والولد وأثر له حسن النية وتوله بالعافية وأسحبه السلامة وأعفه من الجبن وألهمه الجرأة وارزقه الشدة وأيده بالنصرة وألمه السير والسنن وسدده في الحق وأعزل عنه الرياء وخلصه من السمعة واجعل فكره وذكره وذعنه وإقامته فيك ولك. فإذا صاف عدوك وعدوه فقللهم في عينه وصغر شأنهم في قلبه وعدله منهم ولا تدلهم منه. فإن ختمت له بالسعادة وقضيت له بالشهادة فبعد أن يجتاح عدوك بالقتل وبعد أن يجهد بهم الأسر وبعد أن تأمن أطراف المسلمين وبعد أن يولي عدوك مدبرين. اللهم وأيما مسلم خلف غازيا أو مرابطا في داره أو تأحد خالفيه في غيبته أو أعانه بطائفة من ماله أو أمده بإتاد أو شهده على جهاد أو أتبعه في وجهه دعوة أو رعى له من ورائه حرمة فآجر له مثل أجره وزنا بوزن ومثلا بمثل وأعوذه من فعله عوضا حاضرا أن يتعجلوا به نفعه ما قدم وسرور ما أتى به إلى أن ينتهي به الوقت إلى ما أجريت له من فضلك وأعددته له من كرامتك. اللهم وأيما مسلم أهمه أمر الإسلام وحزنه تحزب أهل الشرق عليهم فنوى غزوا أو حم بجهاد فقعد به ضعف أو أبطأت به فاقة أو أخره عنه حادث أو عرض له دون إرادته مانع فاكتب اسمه في العابدين وأوجب له ثواب المجاهدين واجعله في نظام الشهداء والصالحين. اللهم صل على محمد عبدك ورسولك وآل محمد صلاة عالية على الصلوات المشرفة فوق تحيات صلاة لا ينتهي أمدها ولا ينقطع عددها كأتم ما مضى من صلواتك على أحد من أوليائك إنك المنان الحميد المبدئ المعيد الفعال لما تريد برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. One Surah Fatiha, 3 times Surah Ikhlas لأرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات والشهداء مع الصلوات.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. see if they can get it. So, today we have a small presentation to do. So, let's begin our majlis inshallah and then we'll get to our presentation. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Rabbi ishrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Thumma as-salatu was-salam ala sayyidina wa nabiyyina wa habibi ilahil alameen Abil Qasim Muhammad. صلى على محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين واللعنة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين أما بعد. Today we want to talk a little bit about Salatul... Oh, I thought we had it up on the screen. Okay, well we're going to talk a little bit about Salatul Ayat. There's a small presentation to kind of talk about the ahkam and the process of how to perform Salatul Ayat. The significance of this conversation is to explain and go through how to perform this salat, what are the ahkam to ensure that this is a wajibat that we have to perform. Now the nature of Salatul Ayat is that it is one of the 6 wajib salawat that we have to perform. When we talk about the 6 wajib salawat, we can actually go on to the next slide actually. Do I move my finger or something and it'll happen? There are 6 categories of the wajib salawat that we have. Normally when we talk about wajib prayers we think of the 5 daily prayers, but that's one of the categories of salat and prayers that are wajib upon us. The second of these is Salatul Ayat. Salatul Ayat on average is performed between 2 and 5 times a year actually across the globe. Now there are 2 lunar eclipses a year and on average, sometimes we can have 1 lunar eclipse, other years we can have 3 lunar eclipses, but on average there's 2 lunar eclipses a year. And there are between 2 and 5 solar eclipses every year. Now, in total, you could say 5 is very rare. The last time we had 5, I think, was 1935, and the next time we'll have 5 solar eclipses is another 150 years or 200 years from now. So it's going to be a while. So we don't see 5 solar eclipses in a year, but usually, generally, we see between 2 and 4 solar eclipses per year. Now, the total there comes out to be about 6. If you're seeing 2 lunar and 4 solar, that's 6, but not all 6 hit every area of the Earth every year. So while on average it may be that between 4 and 6 eclipses happen in this Earth on a yearly basis, those that we're impacted by in our area may happen twice a year. So it's a wajib amal that comes up not too frequently. So it can happen that because we're not performing it on a daily basis, some of the ahkam we're unsure about, the process we're unsure about. Sometimes it may happen that you only have to recite it once a year, and if you're not paying attention, it can be that it's kind of confusing. So the significance is to talk about it. Amongst the other salawat that we have, right, we lost that one, but that's okay. The other salawat that we have from the wajib salawat is Salat al-Tawaf, Salat of Nadar, Salat of Mayyit. What am I missing? I said Tawaf, Mayyit. Qada al-Walid. Qada of the parents. Qada al-Walidain is wajib upon the eldest son to perform for the father, but it's very recommended to perform from the mother, and it's not just upon the eldest son, it should be upon all of the siblings, and there's entire discussion about what it includes. And then Salat of Ahad and Ijar, meaning those salat that we make wajib upon ourselves either by making an oath or taking a salary for it. So some of the points, let's go on to the next one. Yes. Salat al-Ayat becomes wajib when? When do we have to perform the Salat al-Ayat? Whenever there's a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse. There's no discretion to say, typically when we talk about Salat al-Ayat, we talk about those natural disasters that cause fear in the hearts of people. However, in eclipse, there's no discussion about fear. Whenever a khusuf or khusuf takes place, a solar eclipse or lunar eclipse, we have to recite Salat al-Ayat, even if we don't feel anything about it and it's something that's pretty normal and common and not scary at all. We still have to perform Salat al-Ayat. According to Sayyid Sistani, as ihtiyat wujuban, as a mandatory precaution, if there's an earthquake, we have to perform Salat al-Ayat. Whether we're afraid of it or not, if there's an earthquake, we perform Salat al-Ayat. After that comes in occurrence of celestial or terrestrial phenomenon, meaning those things that cause fear, whether they become atmospheric events like storms, hurricanes, or they become terrestrial events, for example, landslides, for example, sinkholes. Now the condition for when this terrestrial event occurs, it takes place, or a celestial event like atmospheric event takes place, this is where fear becomes a criteria. But the fear that becomes a criteria is not individual fear. To say that, for example, like, I'm afraid whenever there's thunder, and somebody else is not afraid even if they're hit by lightning. No. The fear that qualifies for Salat al-Ayat to become wajib is where majority of the people would become afraid by that occurrence. I myself may be okay, I may be sleeping through the event, but when I wake up I'm like, oh, okay, the sky's black, so what? Everybody's running around crazy, and I'm like, okay. That doesn't mean it didn't become wajib on me. It means that as long as the majority of people are affected by this, it should be something that causes us to recite Salat al-Ayat. Now, in the case of, for example, these celestial and terrestrial events, which when they take place, this is an event that at the time that it's happening is when Salat al-Ayat should be performed. Same thing with our solar eclipses and lunar eclipses. During the actual event is when we have to perform these Salat al-Ayat, and that is when Salat al-Ayat is considered ada, or on time in the condition that it's needed. This is an important point to pay attention to, that sometimes we think like, oh, okay, it's a scary event, when it's over then we'll deal with it. No, even in the event of a scary event, it's something that we have to perform, even in the case of an earthquake. If an earthquake is happening, and there are different types of earthquakes. There are those earthquakes that typically hit the northeast that we kind of sleep through and we don't even know what happened. And then there are those earthquakes that hit other parts of this world and other parts of this country. For example, this weekend there were 2 earthquakes in Afghanistan of over 6 in magnitude on the Richter scale, which actually have caused thousands of deaths and difficulties in those areas. That moment, that salat becomes wajib to perform for the people that are in that area. Let's move on to the next one that talks about some of the fiqh. So, our most relevant, where we live in the northeast, the most common situation for Salat al-Ayat where it becomes relevant for us is going to be the eclipses. And it so happens that this weekend on Saturday there is a solar eclipse. And it is wajib for us to recite Salat al-Ayat on Saturday. Hence the timeliness of the conversation to kind of take the time to detail out and talk about it, right? So, it becomes wajib when the event occurs in our area. Now this is an interesting point. In some of the older books you'll find that it becomes wajib when it occurs in your country. And this is the language that used to be used, that if it happens in your country you have to do Salat al-Ayat. However, when we look at a country like America, the language has been reworded to say your area. So for example, there may be times when, and we mentioned this, that though there are 6 that take place on average in a year, there are times when the eclipse doesn't come to us at all. It only hits the Middle East or it hits far Asia. We don't see it. And then there are other times like Saturday where the entire eclipse is over North America and not really much else. Doesn't really hit many of the other places. The depth of this eclipse, by the way, will be hitting Texas. We only see a partial eclipse. Texas, Alaska, and there's a line that goes from Texas to Alaska where they'll be seeing a full solar eclipse, and that eclipse is called, you ready for this? This is a good one. The Ring of Fire. So it's called the Ring of Fire because of the way that, for example, the eclipse takes place. You actually just see a line of fire outside of a big circle, and this, is about the size of the moon fitting exactly within the sun and right in front of it. It's a lengthy story, but anyway, they'll see the Ring of Fire. We will just see a partial eclipse. And that eclipse makes it mandatory upon us to perform this salat. And the performance of this salat begins, and the time for it begins when the eclipse begins. So it is from the recommended actions that when the eclipse begins until it goes to its peak is when we recite this salat. It's still wajib and ada to recite once it starts its decline, but the istihbab, the recommendation of performing it, or the recommended time for it, the waqt fazilat for it, has passed at that point in time. Once the eclipse is complete and has passed, then at that point in time the salat becomes qada. The ihtiyat, the precaution is that we don't make the niyat of ada or qada. Just recite, I'm reciting Salat al-Ayat, qurbatan. Come on man, you guys are awake. Come on, let's do this together. Qurbatan. Thank you so much. I'm so worried you guys are like falling behind here. I know it's a little bit dry, but the significance of this, the goal of this was after we have this conversation, after Ziyarat-e-Warisa, for those who want to stay, we'll recite Salatul Ayat in Jama'ah as a practice, and it'll make up maybe some of the qadha that we may have in our life where we had a responsibility to recite it. So this way we're sure that whatever we're reciting correctly, we fulfill our wajibat. So that'll be something we can do after Ziyarat-e-Warisa for those who want to stay. We'll have a session here and everyone can stay, men and women, and we'll go through, and at that point in time if anyone has questions about are they doing it right, we can discuss those as well too. So the qadha of this is wajib to perform, which is why it is one of the things that we'll do today as well too. There are some points where a qada, it is possible for a qada not to be wajib. And that's if a partial eclipse took place at some point in time and you had no idea. And then after, so for example like today, let's say that today I come to the realization that I have to perform qada of Salatul Ayat for all of the eclipses that took place in my life. Now what I do is I sit down and I start to research how many eclipses were there per year, and I start looking at which eclipses took place. Those that were a total lunar eclipse or total solar eclipse, for them I have to perform qada. If in my past and in my history there was a partial lunar eclipse or partial solar eclipse that I never knew about, and now I'm discovering, for that, Ayatul Sistani said you don't have to perform the qada for that, and there's no qada on that it's okay. Same thing if I said, okay, I have to do it for all of the earthquakes. Those that I was aware of, and I knew, and it caused fear, and I didn't do, I have to do qada for. But if I would today look up and say, okay, how many times was there an earthquake in Long Island in the past, let's not say how old I am, but past 20 years maybe, right? I'm at least 20 years old. That in the past 20 years, how many times was there an earthquake? And I see that there were 4 earthquakes that took place. But nobody knew that they took place. It wasn't realized. There's no qada for that. I don't have to go and perform that because one, I didn't pay attention to it, didn't know it, it wasn't a common event, and it was in the past. In the case of solar and lunar eclipses, even if it's a total solar eclipse or total lunar eclipse, even if I didn't know it, that I have to recite qada for. That is something I have to make sure that I perform. So, that's where we talk about the idea that if we're ignorant of it, and it was a partial eclipse and I didn't know about it, no obligation. Saturday, you all have to recite it, sorry. I have to tell you at some point, you all have the responsibility to recite it now that it's there. Alright? Let's talk about how do we actually perform this salat. How to perform the salat. This salat in particular, and this is why it's worth having a conversation, is one of those interesting wajib salats that there's more than one way of performing this salat. The traditional way and the complete way as it's worded and the complete form is that Salatul Ayat has within it 10 ruku in 2 rakats. These 10 ruku, the traditional format is that every salat has qira'ah before ruku. So we have to do, the traditional way is what? Is that since I have 5 rukus to perform per rakat, I have to do the qira'at 5 times in the first rakat and 5 times in the second rakat. So the traditional format says this. It says that I start my salat and I recite Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Surah Fatiha. Then I say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, I recite a second surah. Say Surah Ikhlas, Qul huwallahu ahad. I complete the surah. I perform my ruku. After I perform my ruku, I stand up again and I begin again. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Waladhdallin, and then I start Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Qul huwallahu ahad. And I complete this surah again and I perform my third ruku. Then my fourth. After my fourth, when I recite Fatiha and Ikhlas, I do my 5th ruku, and when I complete my 5th ruku, I stand up and go into sajda. Perform sajda like a normal 2 rakat prayer. I stand up again and I repeat again 2 surahs, ruku, 2 surahs, ruku, 2 surahs, ruku, 2 surahs, ruku, and then I go into sajda and complete my prayers. This is the traditional and complete format of reciting Salat al-Ayat. It doesn't take more than 10 minutes, maybe 15 if you really want to take your time with it, but that's the traditional format of reciting the Salat. However, there is a shorter version. And this is where it gets interesting, and this is why it's important to have a practical in this discussion. The shorter version of this salat works on the basis of saying this, that as Bismillah is something that has to be recited before a surah but is not part of a surah, you can actually break up the surah and you can recite one verse or one complete sentence from the surah as part of your rakat, before the 5 rukus. So let me explain what that means. Usually we use Surah Qadr as the example because Surah Qadr has exactly 5 verses and it's easy. And the fact that we're not Arab, so it can happen that we don't know exactly where a sentence is. So for example, you can use a surah that only has 4 ayat if they have complete sentences in it that you can separate out. So for example, إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحُ وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ. إِنَّهُ كَانَ تَوَّابًا. So this could be one that could be broken out, but Bismillah has to be done once, and then after that the verses have to equal 5 after that, or 5 sentences after that. So the best example is Surah Qadr. This is how we do it. We say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Surah Fatiha, we complete. وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ. Then what we do, we say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ فِي لَيْلَةِ الْقَدْرِ. Ruku'. Subhana Rabbil Azim wa bihamdi. Stand up. وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ. Ruku'. I don't have to recite Surah Fatiha. I don't have to recite Bismillah. I don't have to recite anything, just that second verse of the surah. Then I stand up again. لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ خَيْرٌ مِّنْ أَلْفِ شَهْرٍ. Ruku'. Subhana Rabbil Azim wa bihamdi. Stand up again. تَنَزَّلُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ وَالرُّوحُ فِيهَا بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهِمْ مِنْ كُلِّ أَمْرٍ. Ruku'. Stand up. سَلَامٌ هِيَ حَتَّى مَطْلَعِ الْفَجْرِ. Ruku'. And then I go down to sajda. This is a much shorter version in which this can be recited. The surah that I recommend that you use if you want to use a shorter version is Surah Qadr, because it has exactly 5 verses. It's a surah that we recite fairly often, so we're familiar with. We won't get confused saying what comes next. And it's pretty straightforward. Now, if I choose to use this shorter method in one rakat, in the other rakat, I can actually go back and do the full method, and it's no problem. I can pick and choose either which way. I can do one rakat with the shorter method. I can do one rakat with the longer method. I can do one rakat with the same surah and use one rakat with one surah, a second rakat with another surah that has 5 verses. There's no problem with that. It's allowed. But the essence is that it takes something to pay attention to, and which is why it's not a bad idea that we do a little bit of practice with it. But the shorter version makes it something that takes, instead of 10 minutes, takes maybe 4 minutes at that. And we can finish it in a much, much shorter period of time. There's a couple points to remember, right? One is that this is something that we have to perform. Performing our 5 daily prayers on its own is not enough. This is one of the wajibat that every person comes into contact with. It can happen that maybe Allah doesn't give us tawfiq, we never went to Hajj, we never did Salat al-Tawaf. It can happen that our father had no qada, we had no qada for them to recite. It can happen that I never performed Salat al-Mayyit, I never assisted with it. It can happen. All of the other things can happen, but this, like the daily prayers, is something we can't get away from. It's something that is a part of our life, and we will be held accountable, and it is a responsibility to ensure that we perform it. So to know how to perform it is something that's is a responsibility, the same way our daily prayers are a responsibility. This is something that we have a responsibility to. Salatul Ayat can be performed in Jama'ah for an eclipse. Other than that, whether it's about an earthquake, or it's about a sinkhole, or it's about a really bad storm, according to Sayyid Sistani, it's not proven that that can be recited in Jama'ah. So if it should happen that one of those instances take place and I'm in an area where it takes place, it becomes on me to perform it. It may not be that there's a Jama'ah where this action is performed, because it's not proven that those salat of ayat can be performed in Jama'ah. It is wajib to perform the qada of the salat al-ayat. One of the interesting points about that is that I don't have to appoint and say which event in history I'm reciting salat al-ayat for. So if, for example, I look back and I say, okay, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I haven't been performing this prayer and this number of events took place. I don't have to say in my niyat that I'm reciting salat al-ayat for qada of the lunar eclipse that took place on May 14th, 1997, qurbatan ilallah. No. I don't even have to specify if it's for lunar eclipse or solar eclipse. I can perform it and just say the qada of any salat al-ayat that was wajib for me, I'm performing its qada qurbatan ilallah. And that will be sufficient. I don't have to specify which one. Another thing that's interesting is, let's say, for example, God forbid, and it's happened in history, that a number of different events happen simultaneously. There's an eclipse, there's an earthquake, there's a sinkhole. What else you got after that? I mean, that's as bad as I can think of. Let me ask you guys, how many salat al-ayat do you have to recite? Who says 1? Who says multiple? Multiple. If simultaneously multiple events take place that require salat al-ayat, each of those events requires a salat al-ayat to be performed for it. So it may not happen that it ever happens to anyone. Dr. Zal?
What happened in Africa, not here, is one in Elas.
Okay. So let's say that there were 5 events that took place, but in different places around the world simultaneously. Then we only have to recite the one that happened in our area. So if it happened here in Long Island, then I would have to do it. If it happened, for example, in Africa, and the tsunami that hit in Malaysia and the earthquake that hit in Japan happened simultaneously, I don't have to because I wasn't in the area. So one of the restrictions for Salat al-Ayat to become wajib upon us is that it has to happen in our area, which is why it's frightening enough that, for example, a sinkhole, earthquake, and an eclipse happen simultaneously where I am. I don't want to even imagine if more than that. But God forbid, should it happen in my area, that I'm standing here and everything is happening around me, I have multiple Salatul Ayat to perform at that point in time. But inshallah, may that never happen. Sinkholes or landslides, if they cause fear in the community and the people, then that's something that we have to perform it for. So same thing, if it's something in our region, in our area that happens that causes fear in the people as it happens. So for example, I think the original of the hukum is like a village style, where in the village a sinkhole happens, the whole village is afraid now that the whole land is going to sink into the ground. Nowadays, with the size and scale of our cities, it can happen on the opposite end of the city, but it can cause fear in the people who live in that area and who hear about it, that that's a scary item to happen. And there are still places in this earth where a sinkhole happening in the village or in the city will cause fear in the people. And that will be subjective. So I mean, there are sinkholes that are really small that show up in the middle of a road. Nothing. But then there are sinkholes that eat up entire buildings in one shot. Those are things that are very frightening. Those things are very scary. Alhamdulillah, with engineering and things like that, we know pretty well where not to put things that this doesn't happen, but it does still happen from time to time. Not long ago, there was a whole house in the middle of a villa, in the middle of a town in Florida that just disappeared. And the people inside of it, there was nothing to do. And that whole area was afraid that our house is going to be next, the rest of the ground is going to sink in, all of these places will be swallowed up, because when it happens, that whole area, when it goes down, you can't tell where it's going to stop. And you can't tell when it's going to stop. So maybe that it went down now and then it expands again. So that kind of a situation can cause fear. Same thing with a landslide. That unfortunately in Pakistan, after the earthquakes that hit there, the landslides took out entire villages. And you had no idea when it was going to stop. So those are things that people who are in that area, it does create fear in their heart, and at that time the community is afraid that, is it safe in my house? Is it not safe in my house? Can I stay here? Can I not stay here? Is it going to happen to us next? There we're talking about the situation where Salat al-Ayat, now we know we have to perform in that situation. Alhamdulillah, where we are, for the most part, we really haven't had to worry about a lot of these things, and alhamdulillah, may Allah protect us and protect all of the mu'mineen. But in those situations where, for example, in Iraq, there's something that's a sandstorm that comes with black clouds. That creates fear. That creates a lot of fear. When it happens that the black clouds come in, the shops start closing up even from the morning, that they say these clouds are a bad storm that's coming. And people close down shops and you can't see, sometimes they last for days. Those are things that people are afraid of at that point in time. And those who have the consciousness to know, they perform Salat al-Ayat for it because it's very frightening. I've seen some of those. They're very bad. Some of the storms that we have, some of the hurricanes that we have here are very bad. They're very dangerous as well too. So that's it. When the town or the city or the environment I'm in is hit by fear of the fact of what's happening and how bad that storm is, we should at that point in time consider it that that's a situation where, and that's it. The fear is not subjective to Muslimin, that, oh, are the Muslimin afraid? No, mashallah, Muslimin, especially our Shia, it's very famous. Even when there's a really bad sandstorm in Najaf, you can tell if the pilot's a Shia or not. Because the non-Shia one turns around, flies back and says, I'm not landing. The Shia one says, Ya Ali, it goes in. So you can't, it's not about us and are we afraid. It's about, is the society, is the community afraid in that situation? If there's fear in that situation, then we have an obligation to perform it. Does that make sense? So what else do we have? So the qada for those that have to be performed in that sense. Now, here's an interesting point that I didn't get to mention before, is how many qunut you perform. The answer's on board anyway, so how many qunut do we perform? You can, it's recommended that for every second ruku that you perform a qunut. So I did my first ruku, before I go to my second ruku, I do qunut. Rabbana a'atina. Then in my fourth rakat, I do a qunut then again. Then in my sixth rakat, and then in my eighth rakat and my 10th rakat. However, it is also sufficiently fine to just do it in the 10th rakat, meaning the last ruku that I have to do in this prayer, I do my qunut then, and then I finish. And even if I didn't perform a qunut, because a qunut is a mustahab action, not a wajib action, my prayer is still valid and fine, and it's okay. But you have the option to perform it multiple times. You can do up to 5 qunut, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Or just one in the 10th rakat, and it's sufficient, it'll meet it. So, Saturday we have the wujub of this salat. The time for that will begin at 12:08 in New York. The eclipse begins at 12:08. It is recommended to do it before it reaches its peak. The peak where it stops growing is about 1:30. 1:36 I think is the time that I remember reading, or 1:32 is the time. About 1:30 is when the peak of the eclipse will hit, and then it will start to revert back. It's recommended that before it hits its peak to recite the Salatul Ayat, and once the peak has passed, it's still necessary to recite, but it's not it misses some of the recommendation of fadilat of that time to be performed at that time. One of the questions that gets asked is, if there is a wajib salat that comes in, and I have Salatul Ayat wajib upon me as well, which one do I perform? Who says the wajib? Well, okay, who says the farida, meaning the Salat al-Dhuhr, for example, in this case, that will come in? Let's say, for example, Salat al-Dhuhr is going to be at 12:50, and I notice at that point in time I haven't recited Salat of the eclipse. Which one do I recite first? Okay, see, okay. So this is how it works. If the time for both of them is wasi', meaning plentiful, I can pick and choose. I have no problem, I can pick and choose. If it happens, for example, in the case that time for dhuhr sets in, I realize, oh, eclipse. And I know that the waqt of fadilat of the eclipse is passing, I can do the eclipse first. If it happens that I want to do my Salat of Dhuhr and Asr first and then do the eclipse, no problem, I can do that. The only time we face a restriction is when, for example, one of them has less time than the other. That, for example, the time for the eclipse is 5 minutes. And I decide I'm going to read Salat al-Dhuhr first, and in the middle of Salat al-Dhuhr I realize the time of the eclipse is going to pass. I should bring my Dhuhr and pray the one that's Ada and will become Qadha, so that I get the Ada for it. And then recite Salat al-Dhuhr after it. So the only restriction that I have is that if the time becomes so little that the one that has the least amount of time, that I don't have enough time to perform both of them in time, I perform that one first, and the one that I have more time for, I perform second. So because they're both wajib, you could technically do either one, it's not a problem. It's no big deal. You can pick either one because they're both wajib on you at the same time. You can pick and choose. The only restriction we come into is that if by performing this wajib, that wajib becomes qadha, then I have to prefer that wajib over this wajib. And it's the same thing in many times where it can come into our responsibility. To mention, that for example, on Fridays, Salat al-Jum'ah and Salat al-Dhuhr. These are two items that are wajib on us simultaneously. So when the time for Dhuhr sets in, you have two wujub that are active upon you. And you have the ability to choose. Am I going to recite Salat al-Dhuhr or am I going to recite Salat al-Jum'ah? You can choose. But that Salat al-Jum'ah that you recite is wajib. And I've been asked this a couple of times. That is a wajib salat that takes the place of Salat al-Dhuhr. You have the discretion to choose between those two. And it's actually recommended that if I'm not going to recite Salat al-Jum'ah on the day of Friday, that I delay Salat al-Dhuhr enough that the wujub of Jum'ah passes and expires, and only the wujub of Dhuhr remains at that point in time. It's recommended because you have two wajibs, so you pray when you only have one due on you, not two. But it's completely permissible that you can pick and choose between the two, and you have those in the same position that you can pick either one. Doesn't become, in the absence of the imam, Salat al-Jum'ah is wajib takhiri, not wajib aini. Wajib takhiri means I can choose between this wajib and that wajib. And this is the only example that I know of that I can think of immediately off the top of my head where this happens. But in the presence of the imam, then Salat al-Jum'ah on some people, not to everybody, will become wajib aini, meaning you have to do Salat al-Jum'ah and nothing else. But in our time, it's wajib takhiri. So same way, when we have two wujub on us, we have the freedom to choose. But the restriction in the choices is that the other item shouldn't become qadha. Becoming qadha is like, for example, 1/100th of its value remaining. So therefore, we don't let anything become qadha. We ensure that we make it ada and we take care of it on its time. So that was the short discussion on this. We'll do an example of this salat afterwards. Yes? Sure, yeah, please. If anyone has questions, we can ask now, and then other questions we'll do a practical after this. We can do it. Okay, I recited Surah Ikhlas and divided it in 5 parts, not realizing that Surah has only 4 ayat. Am I supposed to pray again? Yes. Unless if, for example, one of the ayat you split into two sections if it was a complete sentence, but I don't think that happens. So if you did Bismillah in one, and then you did Qul Huwallah in the second, Allahu Samad in the third, Lam Yalid in the fourth, Walam Yulad, Walam Yakul Lahu Kufuwan Ahad in the fifth, we have to repray. So the condition is that the surah without the inclusion of Bismillah has to have 5 ayat. If the surah with the inclusion of Bismillah has 5 ayat, then it's not sufficient. So this is one of the restrictions that we have. So that is something that should be reprayed because it didn't meet the condition. Is there any other questions, whether on the lady side or gent side? No?
Question.
Yes.
You have to make it for like Hurricane Sandy and stuff like that?
Do you have to make it up? No. No. So when it comes to terrestrial or celestial issues, other than the eclipse, solar and lunar eclipses is the only place, and full solar and lunar eclipses is where you would make it up. If, for example, like tomorrow's or Saturday's eclipse, which is wajib, I know it's wajib and I didn't do it, then yes, then I have to. But if, for example, I didn't know it was wajib, it didn't become wajib, I didn't realize it, I didn't know enough about it, I didn't know it was happening, and I learned afterwards, then I don't have to make up the qada for it. But if, for example, I knew it was wajib and I intentionally didn't do it, then yes, I have a qada on it. And let's not talk about that, God forbid, it could be a sin as well in that situation too. Yes? For Salat al-Ayat other than eclipses. Where there's an eclipse, so for example Saturday, we can do Jamaat. But where, for example, it's for a sinkhole, where, for example, it's for a landslide, there's no Jamaat in that situation. It's غير مشروع. So what that means to say is that there's no precedent for it being done in Jama'ah, therefore we don't recommend it should be performed in Jama'ah. Does that mean that Allah won't give you credit if you did it? No, I'm not making that statement. But the fact that we haven't seen it, that it should be something that's done in Jama'ah. So which is why, when we do it with our intention and we do the qada, we'll do it with the intention in our mind that this is for some eclipse that may be passed in my life. That this is a wajib that I have to do. So, and that's it. It's something that we should pay attention to because this will become wajib on us on average about between 2 or 3 times a year. So it's something we should pay attention to. It's something we should know about. It's something we should ensure that we perform when it becomes mandatory upon us to do. So I haven't actually paid attention to how many hit our area in North America this year, but Saturday is a big one. So part of it is going to be hitting, a full eclipse in part of the country, and in our area it's I think only 30% that we'll be seeing. So we won't see a full eclipse, but it's still something that becomes wajib. All right. Any other questions? Yes? Exactly. So the qada is only for full eclipse, solar or lunar, that happened in our area. Or that I knew I was supposed to perform and I didn't perform. But if you didn't know it, you don't have to do it. So for example, now looking up and realizing that, when I turned 19 there was a solar eclipse, a partial solar eclipse, and I didn't know about it, and do I have to make up its qada now? No, I don't have to. But if there was a full solar eclipse at that point, then yeah, I have to. I don't want to age myself, but I remember one from when I was in school and they made us go outside and take a look at the eclipse with the special glasses and things like that. But yeah. So according to Sayyid Sistani, Bismillah is wajib to recite before the surah, but it's not counted as one of the verses of the surah. So you can't, and this is something different between Sayyid Khu'i and Sayyid Sistani. Sayyid Sistani, hafidhahullah, made the statement to say that it is wajib to recite Bismillah before the surah, but it's not considered part of the surah. Sayyid al-Khu'i was of the opinion that Bismillah is part of the surah as well as wajib to recite before the surah. I can tell you where the practical difference is. The practical difference is this. Let's say I stand up in Salat al-Dhuhr. I recite Surah Fatiha. Now I want to recite the second surah and I haven't made up my mind which surah I'm going to recite. Maybe today I feel like Surah Kafirun, Surah Falaq, Surah Nas, so many great surahs out there. If I recite Surah Bismillah and I haven't appointed that surah, I have to repeat Bismillah again according to Sayyid al-Khu'i once I figure out which surah I want to recite. According to Sayyid Sistani, I can recite Bismillah and then afterwards I can decide which surah I want to recite, because while it's wajib to recite, it's not considered a part of the surah, so therefore as long as I recited it, I can recite and make the decision of the surah afterwards. You'll actually see this in practical difference when you pray behind someone who is a muqallid of Sayyid al-Khu'i, that you may hear them recite Bismillah 2 or 3 times before they recite the second surah, because maybe in their mind they haven't made the decision. But for example, someone who is in taqleed of Sayyid Sistani, reciting Bismillah and then deciding the surah afterwards is no problem. It's fine. But that's why it's wajib to recite Bismillah before we recite the surah. You can't recite the surah without Bismillah. But it's not considered a wajib part of the surah, which is why that doesn't count as one of the 5 verses according to Sayyid Sistani. It has to be 5 verses without the Bismillah. Good question. If she's an muqallid of Ayatul Khoi, then her prayer is fine. But if it's answered according to the taqleed of Sayyid Sistani, then it's a problem. All right? That's a fantastic question and a great question to ask. That should a woman be in the condition of hayd and nifas, if an eclipse takes place, whether full or partial, they have no qadha to recite for it. They do not have to recite anything. They are free and clear, and they don't have to make it up. The same way, for example, with their daily prayers. With their daily prayers that are wajib on them every day, in the cycles of hayd and nifas, they don't have to perform them, and there's no qadha for them. In the same context, should a salatul ayat come due in the cycle of hayd or nifas, there is no qadha for it. Same principle. Good, very good question, actually. Very good question. We'll finish inshallah. ندعوك باسمك العظيم الأعظم الأعز العجل الأكرم يا الله. We repeat 10 times. يا الله 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 يا محمود بحق محمد يا أعلى بحق علي يا فاطر السماوات بحق فاطمة يا محسن بحق الحسن يا قديم الأحسان بحق الحسين. Oh Allah, accept a small ibadat from us. Ya Allah, forgive our sins and cover our flaws. Oh Allah, keep us on your upright religion of Islam. Ya Allah, those amongst our families, our communities, the mu'mineen who are suffering through sickness and disease, Ya Allah, give shafa'at to the mu'mineen wherever they are. Oh Allah, those mu'mineen, Muslimeen who are suffering through insecurity and difficulty and strife around the world, Ya Allah, give aman to the Muslimeen and mu'mineen wherever they are. Oh Allah, keep our children on the upright religion of Islam. Ya Allah, we have gathered here with hajat by the right of the night of Thursday, by the right of the mention of Ahlul Bayt, and by the right of your religion. Ya Allah, fulfill the hajat of all of the mu'mineen and Muslimeen. Oh Allah, hasten the reappearance of Sahibul Zaman. Make us and our families from the upright supporters of Sahibul Zaman, and entitle us to the ziyarat of Imam Hussein in this world and the shafa of Aba Abdullah in the akhirah. Rahimullah man yaqra Surah Al-Fatiha ma'as salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Bismillah.
زيارة ورثة. السلام عليك يا وارث آدم صفوة الله. السلام عليك يا وارث نوح النبي الله. السلام عليك يا وارث إبراهيم خليل الله. السلام عليك يا وارث موسى كريم الله. السلام عليك يا وارث عيسى روح الله. السلام عليك يا وارث محمد حبيب الله. السلام عليك يا وارث علي أمير المؤمنين ولي الله. السلام عليك يا ابن محمد المصطفى. السلام عليك يا ابن علي المرتضى. السلام عليك يا ابن فاطمة الزهراء. السلام عليك يا ابن خديجة الكبرى. السلام عليك يا ثار الله وابن ثاري والورد والموتور. أشهد أنك قد أقمت الصلاة وآتيت الزكاة وأمرت بالمعروف ونهيت عن المنكر وأطعت الله ورسوله حتى أتاك اليقين. فلعن الله أمة قتلت ولعن الله أمة ظلمت ولعن الله أمة سميت بذلك فرجت به. يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله، أشهد أنك كنت نور في الأصلاب الشامخة والأرحام المطهرة، لم تنجسك الجاهلية بأنجاسها ولم تلبسك من مزدحمات ثيابها، وأشهد أنك من داعم الدين وأركان المؤمنين، وأشهد أنك الإمام البر التقي الرذي الذكي الهادي المهدي، وأشهد أن الأئمة من ولدك كلمة التقوى وعلام الهدى والأروة الوثقى والهجة على أهل الدنيا. وأشهد الله وملائكته وأنبياءه ورسوله أني بكم مؤمن وبيابكم موقن بشرائع ديني وخواتيم عملي، وكلبي لكلبكم سلم وأمري لأمركم متبع. صلوات الله عليكم وعلى أرواحكم وعلى أجسادكم وعلى أجسامكم وعلى شاهدكم وعلى غائبكم وعلى ظاهركم وعلى باطنكم. زيارة حضرة علي أكبر. السلام عليك يا ابن رسول الله، السلام عليك يا ابن نبي نبي الله. السلام عليك يا ابن أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا ابن الحسين الشهيد. السلام عليك أيها الشهيد وابن الشهيد. السلام عليك أيها المظلوم وابن المظلوم. لعن الله أمة قتلتك، ولعن الله أمة ظلمتك، ولعن الله أمة سميت بذلك فرضيت به. جاءت الشهداء كربلاء. السلام عليكم يا أولياء الله وأحباء. السلام عليكم يا أشفياء الله ووداء. السلام عليكم يا أنصار دين الله. السلام عليكم يا أنصار رسول الله. السلام عليكم يا أنصار أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليكم يا أنصار فاطمة سيدة النساء العالمين. السلام عليكم يا أنصار أبي محمد الحسن بن علي ولي الناصر. السلام عليكم يا أنصار أبي عبد الله بأبي أنتم وأمي تبتم وطابت الأرض التي فيها دفنتم وفزتم فوزا عظيما. فيا ليتني كنتم معكم فأفوز معكم. زيارة حضرة عباس. السلام عليك يا أبا الفضل عباس ابن أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا ابن السيد الوسيم. السلام عليك يا ابن أول القوم إسلاما وأخدمهم إيمانا وأخواتهم بدين الله وأخواتهم على الإسلام. أشهد لك أن نصحت لله ولرسوله وللأخيك فنعم الأخ المواسي. فلعن الله أمة قتلت، ولعن الله أمة ظلمت، ولعن الله أمة استهلت منك المحارم وانتهكت حرمة الإسلام. فنعم الصابر المجاهد المهام الناصر والأخ الدافع عن أخيه المجيب إلى طاعة الرب الراغب فيما زهد فيه غير من الثواب الجزيل والثناء الجميل. والحقك الله بدرجاتك آبائك في جنات النعيم. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله. السلام عليك يا ابن رسول الله. السلام عليك يا ابن أمير المؤمنين وابن السيد الوسيم. السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين. السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله الحسين ولا تسعة المعصومين من ذريتك علي بن الحسين زين العابدين ومحمد بن علي الباقر وجعفر بن محمد الصادق وموسى بن جعفر الكاظم وعلي بن موسى الرضا ومحمد بن علي التقي الجواد وعلي بن محمد النقي الهادي والحسن بن علي العسكري. السلام عليك يا حجة الله بن الحسن يا صاحب الزمان. السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن. السلام عليك يا كعبة الإيمان. السلام عليك يا إمامنا وإمام الإنس والجان ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم كل وليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه ويرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا
Sounded like racing you or something?